Ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience, on behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada and Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee, I, Dr. Kausar Ahmed, welcome all of you to a special webinar session with Natalija Vojno from Toronto, and she's a Rotary Peace Fellow. And today we are going to hear her works and her research and her vision in terms of women empowerment and environment. And it's a wonderful afternoon, and I welcome all of you to be with us for next 1 hour or so. Today we have our practicum student, Monisha Shah, and she will be conducting the whole session with the rest of the speakers. We also have with us Dr. Professor Shirley Thompson from University of Manitoba, who will be joining a little later in this session. So please tune in. As a formality, we always do the treaty acknowledgement. And here we have Conflict of Resilience Research Institute is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me welcome Monisha Shah, today's Master of Ceremony, to conduct the event. Thank you very much. Monisha, floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kausar, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to the webinar today. The theme of the webinar is, as you know, the role of women in safeguarding the environment. And today we have Ms. Natalija and Dr. Shirley Thompson joining us. And I would just introduce both the speakers before I hand over the platform to them. And so Ms. Natalija is a current Rotary Peace Fellow at the Rotary Peace Center. And she has an amazing record. Like, she has worked with the private companies, she has worked with NGOs, she has worked with the government, and she has also worked at local, provincial, and international levels. And she has worked for fresh water policy. She has been a speechwriter for the Ontario's Minister of the Environment, and she has also led various youth networks on global forums and in countries like Egypt, Sweden, Korea, etc. Like, that makes her very inspirational, and we are very happy to have you here. She also co-founded one of the peace building projects called NASA Gora. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but this is what she does, and we are very happy to have you here. And for the second speaker, Dr. Shirley Thompson, she is currently the Associate Professor at the Natural Resource Institute at the University of Manitoba. And her research involves, she has various publications, and some of her research topics were the vulnerability of sustainable livelihoods and environmental health in Mi'kmaq communities, and several others. And currently she is a principal investigator at the Mino Bima project. And Mimo Bima is it's a indigenous term which means living the good life, and she would speak more about it. So that's for the speakers today, and I hand over the platform to Ms. Natalija.
Thank you, Monisha, and thank you, Dr. Ahmed. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you for all of you who are tuning in today. So I'll be speaking a bit about empowering youth and my work in grassroots community engagement. Next slide, please. So to begin, I'll give you a bit of an overview of my early influences, share examples of female leadership that has inspired me and led in my own work in water, walk you through the pathway to grassroots engagement, some lessons learned from there, and especially drawing from youth engagement. And I'll then conclude with a little bit about the Rotary Peace Fellowship and what that has meant. So My own beginning was in Bosnia, a country that has been ravaged by civil war, and it very much influenced my desire to work in peace and to work with water in the way that I have. Next slide, please. I'm Canadian bred. The land of pluralism, maple syrup, and nature's water managers, beavers, have influenced me greatly my entire life. David Suzuki and Maud Barlow were early influences. Other prominent women, next slide, that have made a substantial contribution to water management within Canada, let alone throughout the rest of the world, include lectures on Indigenous rights and legal affairs, in addition to Dr. Shirley Thompson, prominent lawyers and environmental campaigners, IJC commissioners such as Marilyn Fair, campaigners such as Dr. Ann Bell, and champions when it comes to water conservation in industries such as Brenda Lucas. So these are just a few. I would need an entire PowerPoint presentation worth of all the women that have shown leadership in the water space. And then there's also other organizations that I have had a chance to connect to through some of my international engagement. And I would just like to recommend the work of the Women for Water Partnership that engages at the grassroots, the national and the global level, empowering women through WASH. And next slide, please. So my own work following undergrad began as a speechwriter for Ontario's Minister of Environment and Climate Change. This is a really rewarding time. It was 1 year after the Water Opportunities and Water Conservation Act passed in Ontario. And there was quite a lot of excitement about how to implement this piece of legislation. Following an election and a minority government, there were far less opportunities to stay within this role. And I had been inspired to continue the work in water policy. However, finding that the field tends to be very dominated by engineers, and going through interviews and also learning that an MSc was required, I quickly decided what my next step would be. So next slide. That's when I went to UNESCO IHE, now known as IHE Delft, and began an MSc in Water Resource Management, focused on water conflict management. This was a tremendous opportunity to study with peers from all around the world, and it was the founding of the Water Youth Network, which was also incidentally founded by an all-female team, and I was fortunate to be a founding member. Brought on in the very early stages. Some things that I learned while living in the Netherlands was about how the Dutch democracy is born from their water boards and how the water is managed. Learned about the forward-thinking polluter pays principles as applied to the EU Water Framework Directive and how to value water from the very beginning. How to live well with water, to enjoy it through the canals, as you can see pictured behind us, really watching the seasons change in that way. And then there's quite a lot of innovative land use planning. Creativity was taken really quite seriously in the Netherlands. It being a small country, every square meter needed to count. Next slide, please. So to talk to you a bit about the Water Youth Network, which is a pride and joy, and it continues to grow across the world, has engaged with from the Budapest Water Summit to the Singapore International Water Week to Stockholm World Water Forum. This has been a place to really galvanize the potential of young people, to give them a platform on the global stage, to show that they're true partners in achieving sustainable development goals. In fact, during Budapest, we were able to lobby for an independent SDG for water. And at the time, we also introduced innovative concepts like waste as a resource. Next slide, please. One of the things and early innovations that we were able to do as the Water Youth Network is to really leverage digital tools to connect. So the Water Youth Network itself operates entirely remotely. Yes, our secretariat was in the Netherlands, but teammates could connect through Google, working online, and this has been from 2012 up until present day. So some of the things that we did were a little bit new at the time. A recent pride was having the UN Youth Envoy back in 2019 engage in a webinar talking about the importance of youth in Goal 6 and Goal 16, so water and peace, and the overlap there. And so we spoke a bit about the research that we'd been doing about the way the young people can engage in water diplomacy. And what we found is that there's really a need for more spaces for creative and impactful participation of young people. Although there have been 2 UN Security Council resolutions supporting the role that young people can take, more action is still needed. And I will speak a little bit more to some of the barriers that young people face to engage in highly securitized water topics. I'd also just like to highlight 2 really interesting platforms that you can look at just to see some of the innovations that young people are coming up with. So one is the platform operated by the Water Youth Network, and the other is the Youth for Water and Climate platform operated by the International Secretariat for Water with the World Youth Parliament for Water. Next slide, please. One of the most interesting experiences I had with the Water Youth Network, and one of my final ones, was co-facilitating a workshop on the Nile Basin. And there we brought together conflict-afflicted young people from South Sudan, Egypt, from the Caucasus, from Mexico, from Cameroon, to talk about what the potential future in the Nile could look like. We applied innovative strategies. We used strategic foresight, essentially meaning that we would look at the 3 horizons of change and encourage them to start from the future and then work backwards to imagine how the Nile could be prosperous and sustainable. So there you can actually see the words of young people as they envision relations on the Nile and how they could be. Dialogue was stressed as being quite important, and in the next slide, I do have a video, but perhaps I can share that and it could be distributed in a different way as we are going to be short on time. Next slide. So some of the barriers for young people that we found in the research that we did on youth engagement and water diplomacy and through this workshop on the Nile Basin was that there's some group-specific barriers that young people face. That could be visa requirements, language barriers, local experts lack the ability to present outside their region. Now, mind you, this was done prior to COVID and prior to some of the technological advancements that we have today. We found that there was exclusion from decision-making, limited freedom of speech, that their participation would be co-opted for political means or private. But there was various levels of literacy and education, even amongst the youth. And so sensitivities around how we spoke and offered introductions to topics from the beginning. Lack of funding was one that came up significantly, affecting many different aspects of how young people can pilot their own initiatives and start to engage. And some of the risks included career risks for activism. So on one hand, young people are expected to be innovative, to push the boundary, to advance policies, and yet they might not all have the security blanket in order to be able to safely do so. Next slide. So I'll speak a bit more to what can be done to address some of these barriers. And so first criteria is financial input. This is the first thing that any young activist or youth organizer might ask for you. And it's adequate funding for them to self-organize with reduced barriers in reporting. Social and cultural acceptance is another. There can be stigma about young people and what their capacities are. Their expertise might not be acknowledged or understood, and there really needs to be acceptance of diversity and really seeing that as a reward in terms of the robustness of the solutions that can come when multiple different perspectives are brought to the table, both within a country in terms of rural and urban areas, different ethnicities, different languages, genders. And then sustainable institutional support and inclusion. So here it's helpful to have youth-oriented policies within the government, to have legislation that's in place, to include young people in transboundary water issues, to create pathways for them to do so. One that's really important is including young people in political processes. Not only will young people inherit the future and be responsible for the implementation of decisions made today, but by not having all the participants involved in, say, peace agreements, it risks and compromises the sustainability of those peace agreements and the understanding of the constituency that will be responsible for receiving those. Next slide, please. So community connection and mobilization is another criteria. So what that could look like is coordination among youth initiatives, groups, and networks, having continuity between the generations of young people that engage, so even peer-to-peer mentorship there, more mechanisms for cross-cutting information exchange. Webinars like this are a great way to continue to share tacit knowledge. Then capacity, skills, and development. Really having partnerships between youth groups and organizations like, say, the Global Water Forum or OECD Water Governance Initiative are great success stories of intergenerational collaboration. Security, so this is a really important one, ensuring that young people have safety during the implementation of programs. Some of them might be operating in conflict-affected areas. And also ensuring that there's programs to mitigate against climate-induced migration. That could take many different forms in terms of improving youth livelihoods, opportunities for employment, opportunities for them to engage directly in preventative measures in their home countries, in agriculture. So there's quite a lot of different steps that can be taken, and I'm happy to speak more to this during the Q&A, or if anyone wants to reach out after the presentation. Next slide, please. So now I'll speak a little bit about my own pathway and career and how I've tried to engage in water in different ways. With the Water Youth Network, as I mentioned, we have engaged quite a bit at the international level in growing the global network. One opportunity was speaking to the high-level political forum of the UN, reporting on SDG 6. And the high-level political forum, for those who do not know, is where countries report on their success to date on achieving Agenda 2030 and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. As a campaigner for environmental defense, I had the privileged opportunity to work on issues of algal blooms in Lake Erie and to also tackle plastic pollution by putting out an agenda-setting report that was accompanied by the presence of the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Mr. Glenn Murray at the time, or the Honorable Glenn Murray, and also the representatives of the agricultural community and Alice. And one of the things that I learned during my time in environmental defense was the absolute importance of including stakeholders beyond the usual suspects. As a young woman coming from the city, I would go into rural areas, I would attend agricultural meetings, I would speak with the industry that might traditionally be seen as being at odds with yuppie environmentalists, because it was important to show that if the two of us, that could be different of opinions in terms of how the environment is navigated could align, then policymakers would really pay attention to that. Next, please. Another engagement was through art. So Greatness, the Great Art for Great Lakes is a program that was run by Waterlution. I had the opportunity to participate in the engagement. And what's pictured here is an example of a really interesting exhibit that you could see in the Science Centre here in Ontario, a collaboration between artists and a young science student. And each of those little origami pictures is a folding of an endangered species. So there are ways to engage the public and to communicate about water that are beyond a more technical scope, and that can really inspire hearts to care a little bit more. And the other interesting thing about the image is it also represents the benthic layers of Lake Ontario as well. Next slide. Another female-led organization is the Canadian Freshwater Alliance. Here, I had the privileged opportunity of working on the Navigable Waters Protection Act. As you can see in this infographic that was prepared for the campaign a few years back, it shows how navigation laws were changed in Canada over time, including the ruptures that were made where environmental impact assessments were delinked from the process of approvals of major projects. And due to the public outcry, which also included the foundation of Idle No More, there was a response with the incoming and current federal government to redress these changes and to modernize environmental laws. So this is a real collaborative effort, and the Canadian Freshwater Alliance pulled one piece, and that was the navigable waters protection. There was also fisheries and impact assessment criteria as well. Next slide, please. So there are different ways to engage. I just listed a few, but I'll move quickly so we can get to Q&A. Next slide, please. In terms of the corporate work, I did have a chance to work in business development with Raingrid. Next slide, please. And throughout those previous experiences, there was a lot of design thinking and ideation that was necessary. So not just advocacy, but really thinking outside the box. And so this is an example of the design process that was used to develop a peace platform called Nova Agora. Sounds similar to Nasza Agora, but different. Next slide. And sometimes when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So I did take a little bit of time off from my career to volunteer in Mexico, where I worked on gray water filtration systems in rural Mexico. And this was also an opportunity to learn about gender dynamics as well. In one community in particular, it was very uncomfortable for me to participate in manual labor, which I had been doing up until that point. So there were some lessons learned along the way. Next slide, please. Some really quick points I just want to bring home is that coalitions matter. We can't work on these large systemic issues on our own. Consulting on the problem framing, not just the solution, is important when we're talking about engaging with communities. Everyone sees a different piece of the puzzle. Engage people beyond the usual suspects, respect the strengths that they all bring, and that integrated water management isn't just talk. It's really about bringing the different stakeholders together in a room, or nowadays on Zoom or online. Next slide, please. Maintain curiosity. Main thing here is ask the questions. Ask the questions that can reveal a much better solution that will satisfy the needs of all parties involved. Next slide. And we might try to change systems, but the first thing we need to recognize is that we are part of their system. So part of that change starts with ourselves and our own perspective. Next slide. As a Rotary Peace Fellow, I cannot finish without speaking a little bit to the program. I happen to be studying at the Rotary Peace Center that's based in Japan, while I am in Toronto on the Humber River on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas. The Rotary Peace Fellowship has been a really privileged opportunity to pivot my career in order to be able to link peace to water more strongly. And there's 50 master's participants that are selected each year. So this is just a little bit of an overview. Sorry, I can answer more questions in the Q&A. Next slide. And if you'd like to stay in touch on topics of mediation, which is part of the direction in which I'm transitioning my career to in terms of looking at common pool resources, conflict coaching, engagement design, and water policy in general, I'd be happy to keep the conversation alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalija, for your presentation. That was very interesting, and I'm sure we have some questions from the viewers, and I personally also have some questions. And so we have to wait for Dr. Shirley Thompson. Oh, Dr. Shirley Thompson is here with us. So so either we can address some questions to you right now, or we can wait for Dr. Shirley to finish her presentation and address all the questions together at the end. What would you prefer?
I'm happy to answer at the end.
All right, then hello, good afternoon, Dr. Shirley Thompson, and thank you so much for joining us in. And Ms. Natalija just got finished with her presentation, so we can move on to yours. And I have introduced the viewers about you. They know what you do, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for your graciousness in allowing my schedule and to complete this. Now, I'm wondering if it would be okay if I could share the screen, share my screen.
Yes, of course.
I'm just trying to find the...
Or else, Professor, you can send it to me in email. I will, once you speak, I'll just quickly set it up for you.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. I think it's too big to send, and that was the issue, that it bounced back, right?
Okay. There is a share icon. If you kindly try that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Share and share screen. Share screen. Okay. And somehow it just doesn't give me the share application window. Share. Just doesn't operate. So
So Dr. Thompson seems to be having some kind of technical issue, and that's all right. We can move on to the Q&A session with Ms. Natalija until then. All right. And okay, so we have some questions from the audience. So let's address those first before I ask my questions. So the first okay, can you see the question?
So what are the barriers to gender equality and sustainable ecosystem management? It really depends on where. Sometimes women experience threats upon their life as activists in some parts of the world. It's really quite dangerous to be an activist engaging in ecosystem protection. I'm thinking to Indigenous women in different parts of the world who are working on land preservation issues. So that's one. Other barriers might be in terms of career advancement, and this can happen anywhere, in terms of women needing to make compromises between family planning and advancing in their career as water managers. Let alone, okay, next question. In your opinion, how should we better engage Indigenous women at a decision policy-making level for water crisis in Canada? So first, I must preface by saying that I am in no means an expert to answer, but it would be how to really engage more respectfully and how to understand how Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people would like to be engaged. To also understand that we can't treat cultures as monolithic groups, but that there are individual representatives within each culture that might have more of a relationship to water, and that those are the appropriate parties, and to also respectfully understand that there might be lots of people asking them questions as well.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Natalija, for answering those questions. And seems like Dr. Shirley's presentation is working now. And so you can proceed with your presentation, Dr. Shirley. And we would be addressing more questions to Natalija and to Dr. Shirley after your presentation.
Thank you, and sorry for the delay. I just want to talk today. I'm so honored to talk today about a woman and the environment. And I'm starting with the picture of a permaculture course. And you can see the people that talks around environmental sustainability, environmental systems, feeding people, and giving back to the earth. So I work at the Natural Resources Institute, and I led this course, and I co-taught it with an Indigenous elder. And I wanted to display that as one kind of model of education and change. And through this, we worked with different communities, different farmers, including Garden Hill First Nation. We had 3 people from Garden Hill First Nation taking the course who weren't in the graduate program in the University of Manitoba, but were leaders in their community who were working on a farm there. And some of the participants were landscape architects that worked with them to develop a 20-year plan. So that's kind of some of the work I do. And I wanted to bring that in and consider this as a place, you know, this basic needs, this working with the environment of women's roles in the environment. And we see so many women working in the environment, although to some people they're invisible, right? They're inspiring change, they're asking for change from the old colonial model. And we look at I Don't Know More, which Dr. Alex Wilson from U of Sask, developing a network of Indigenous communities in Canada, fighting for sovereignty, fighting for land-based education. We recently celebrated or, honored the 5-year murder of Beta Kakera, who founded a coalition uniting Indigenous folks in Honduras. Winona LaDuke is just south of the border here in Winnipeg, an activist who really has done so much around environmental economics, fought Enbridge Pipeline in so many ways, and been such an inspiration to many. And you'll recognize Wingira Matha, a Kenyan scholar who led the Green Belt movement, Vandana Shiva, and all sorts of networks, women working in networks of Indigenous all around the world for more democratic food systems. But we often see women in struggle, right? Even the early ones of Rachel Carson, Gro Buntland, is asking for change, systemic change. So not looking at the existing system of natural resource and environmental education, which really came out of colonialism. So we do have to give that a critique in our environmental education now. Is this where we've come from? And that has been extractive natural resources and colonialism. So that's important to review, and that's missing in some programs. And I even look at my own program and think, where are the Indigenous people? Where are the women in the leadership around, in the deans and directors and heads? They're very much missing. So, there's a range of environmental education and sustainability now, environmental roles, but often education is now only transitioning. And some places, the patriarchy does not want it to change, right? So that's the framework unfortunately we're working in, is that father knows best, an authoritarian command and control system that natural resources and environmental education came from. There is not nature observation and conservation and environmental impacts, but seen as separate from humans. And how do we get to decolonization, reconciliation, diversity, regeneration, post-human, and sustainability? And this is not only environment, right? That's why I share this slide from Seema below, looking at the foundations of global health and seeing how it came out of colonialism and how it is only now addressing the social determinants of health, and had a very paternalistic approach. The problem that students are still facing is that they are facing colonialism and they are facing paternalism. And this is not going to get us to sustainability and regeneration until we move to decolonization and regeneration and post-human. So looking at how we flatten the hierarchical structures to have power with rather than power over, where we move from the existing frames of conscious capitalism and growth at all costs to the emerging frames of the Green New Deal, green growth, and reframe to talk about rights of nature and problematizing that the economy is a man-made construct. So it's not serving all beings, and it's even human beings. It's so that's where we need a moratorium on extractives, debt jubilee, guaranteed minimum wage, looking at other ways of doing things and seeing the role that environment can make in a Green New Deal. If we have a net zero, if we have distributed energy. So part of this is definitely challenging settler colonialism and looking at the logic of elimination and the claim to land and looking at land back, considering that the violence on the land, is felt by women, that extractive industries have drilled, mined, and fracked on lands on or near resource-rich Indigenous for decades, and how that's also hurt women as well. And this other way of looking at things, then we think, therefore we are, just thinking in our minds, when honestly, if our hearts aren't in it, if our bodies aren't in it, then we're really not part of the solution, we're part of the problems. So this expression, we thank, therefore we are becoming, is realizing we're all learning, we're all on this journey, and that we have to appreciate the environment and natural resources and each other and all relations in order to get there. I'm a PI, the principal investigator in a $2.5 million partnership grant, and it's really focused on healing culture, governance, and land to bring student benefits that include Indigenous language, employment, post-secondary education, building homes, and community benefits. So looking at self-determination, economic development, sustainable livelihoods, Indigenous food systems, sustainable housing, community capacity, and it being reconciliation and action. So, getting money to people to get into education has been the important thing. So a talent grant where all, 80-90% goes to students, and making sure that we don't study Indigenous students, we work with them and we capacity build, and so that 80% goes to Indigenous students, and that we build economic development. This is working with Garden Hill to actually brand and market fish, and so we helped to they always had a fishing co-op, but to create a business plan and to incorporate and work with the value added. Women always worked with men on fishing around fish handling and value added, and to bring that back. When freshwater fish came, they actually disallowed, put all the women out of work right away, because they created a fish processing plant in Winnipeg and only allowed fish processed at their facility to be sold. So, we worked with fishers, the Fisher Co-op, to sell that fish, and then worked with communities for food security, loaning fishing nets to families, and gardening, building soil in the community for sustainable food, making sure there was capacity building, and growing more than just farms and gardens, growing youth capacity. We now have a program that we're working with Broken Head Ojibwe Nation called Kittigay, which is an Anishinaabe word meaning to plant. And it is to grow plants, but also reconciliation. So it's an entry-level program we're starting, and we're working with 6 faculties. It's really wonderful. We're transdisciplinary. We're working with some great Indigenous instructors who are, you know, the story of stone soup is everyone was hungry, but by working together and with this magic stone, this idea, they were able to bring feed everyone and work together in the future, which is the biggest thing, right? It's going through the School of Agriculture, but being community-based, project-based in Broken-Headed Divination. So this is a vision to be community-led and project-based to transform education and food policy and leapfrog from colonial imposed to self-determined and community-led education. We're piloting these courses, and we're doing it based on a decolonization framework, realizing colonization and oppression can have profound effects on people, and we have to build that social capital. So working on this lovely circle of courage for decolonization to build belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson, for your presentation. That's some impressive work that you have been doing and are doing, involving Indigenous communities, working with them and for them as well, and for the rest of the world, like the environment. That's something that inspires me and several others, I hope. And so before we delve into the Q&A session, I just had a comment I wanted to pass, which I noticed how both of you spoke, but of course, Dr. Thompson was not aware that Natalija spoke that as well, was the fact that so Natalija spoke in her presentation regards how we are a part of a system, and if we want to change the system, we should start by changing ourselves. And you mentioned that you need to put your heart and body into the work that you are doing. That just correlates to me, and peace begins with yourself first. So these are like both of you working in the similar field and having same thoughts is really fascinating. And
thank you.
So I believe there are some questions, and I myself also have some questions. So let's just address this one first.
Thank you, Jagat Shah, for this question. From your experiences, how do you think the private sector can best support initiatives to empower women and support sustainable development? Great question. The private sector definitely has a role, you know, through funding, through job opportunities, through promoting women and having a career track. So not just a job track, a career track. We'd like to see leadership in the boardroom, leadership in deans and directors. Like I find at university that deans and directors, you know, instead of a co-learning model, if they could, they work on an authoritarian model. So how we can develop and build a kind of more cooperative, collegial, co-learning opportunities, and that will benefit everybody's work. The better you feel about your work, the more you accomplish, and the more you're able to provide for your, you know, deliver the goals of the company as well. So thinking that environment and sustainability and women are key to success in for any company, and to have that into your plan. So seeing that as a goal, the sustainable development goals include women. You know, could we not include that in business management goals? Is to promote and ensure equity in industry.
I hope that addresses your question, Dr. Jagat Shah. And so Dr. Prosser had a question for Ms. Natalija. So let's hear from him.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirley. It's an honor to host you today once again from our side. Thank you so much, Natalija. Fascinating presentation on youth and water. So I have just a general question to both of you, since you are both of you are working in this field for some time. So what are the essential challenges you have really encountered, Natalija, with regards to empowering women in water rights? And Professor Shirley, particularly, what do you see essential obstacles to decolonize our education system and and get into more inclusive team building, as you mentioned a number of times in your brief presentation? So anyone can start. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Thank you for this question, and thank you for this wonderful lecture that focuses on women. That's something, we need opportunities to consider this, and actually maybe men need to consider their role, right? And how they have to step back or give opportunities for women. In education, I do see the need for reconciliation or equity, diversity, and inclusion committees. That could be key. Thinking of these things, which unfortunately or horribly have not been, and you see the lack of diversity, and in administration in particular, and that will help support women, because there are a boys' club, and we live in a patriarchal economy and system here, but also considering the key role that Indigenous cultures and Indigenous people can play, where there's such a long tradition of stewardship and knowledge of the earth, and a different worldview that is so profound it could change everything. And and I think that's a concern for patriarchy, is that it will destabilize patriarchy. But that's also what's needed for the environment, right? Is some destabilization of this existing hold that patriarchy has had for so long, and the extractive colonial activities that have occurred, that are still occurring, right? And given all sorts of public funds to continue to desecrate the earth. So rebuilding towards sustainability, but more so to regeneration and post-human is a reorientation, right? That environmental education needs to update its playbook and start to include, like the permaculture. This permanent culture is this way of thinking and doing. We have to learn how we can work with the earth, how we can work with the sun and all the energies to be sustainable. And that's not happening right now. It really needs a shift.
Thank you.
Dr. Thompson, what you said earlier about power with was really poignant, and the way that you speak to how to share and how to be in relationship really makes me think of Martin Buber's I and thou, and the sense of reverence for the other. So not being in relation as an I and it, and the other person or the other entity or nature or water, Nibi, as it's known in Anishinaabe, being something that we utilize, but how do we be in service of one another? And so I think to the question of, well, what are the barriers to how women are engaged or how youth are engaged? I think it's as long as there's a central point, and then from that central point, we're engaging outside rather than being in circle together, there's always going to be challenges, because across generation, there's values. Those that have been on this earth longer have far more tacit knowledge and wisdom that they can share with the younger generations. The younger generations have ways of engaging with technology and with one another that they can contribute. So it's in really finding partnership in one another that we all benefit, and in being able to hold power gracefully and step back and allow others to step into their power as well.
Thank you.
So I believe there are some more questions from the audience.
I briefly spoke to this one, but I think Dr. Thompson, if you, as it's your specialties.
Well, there's some great voices to listen to, and around with Indigenous women, and if we could amplify those voices. But what I've seen, I also had a doctoral student, Dr. Stuart Hill, just completed, and the point we found, and he found, was that we need Indigenous-led services. Just like we need Indigenous-led health services, we need Indigenous-led water and environmental services. And right now, the systems that are being brought in are, through colonial government, Canadian government, and it is based on their value system of money, which has meant a lot of cisterns, a lot of these, which we know contribute to COVID-19, all sorts of bacterial infections. They're really not unsafe water. So we have to shift from this colonial mentality and build a technical service for Indigenous peoples, and the university should be supporting this, right? And industry as well, right? So seeing that there'll be all sorts of solutions if the colonial government lets go of the reins and stops holding Indigenous people back, and all the barriers they've placed in the way has made it very difficult. And it's time that they, they step back and transfer funding to First Nations to do the work themselves, rather than waste the money.
A quick question for you, Dr. Thompson, if I may, is on that same topic, what are your thoughts on source water protection as a way of guaranteeing drinking water for First Nations? So ensuring that it's protected from where it is, even before the treatment is needed.
Thank you. So that's so key, right? Is preserving or protecting the land and land stewardship and land guardianship. And that's something we can learn from Indigenous people. So protecting the water sources. And at this time, I want to say that I am on Treaty 1, but we get our water from Treaty 6 from Shoal Lake First Nation. And that the problem has been that we have protected the water source there, and we benefit greatly in Winnipeg from a very clean, very pure water that hardly needs any treatment. So made millions by piping the water hundreds of kilometers, but that's prevented the community of Shoal Lake 40 and created barriers for Freedom Road. So they haven't had a road, they've had to take a barge. They haven't had safe drinking water in themselves. So source water protection has to be done in a way that respects everyone. It's absolutely necessary to protect this source of life, this sacred, seeing water as sacred, as such a strong, large part of everyone's being. We're mainly made up of water, but also that even with source water protection, there can be a command and control colonial approach, and that needs to be changed. And we have to, pay the rent, right? We've taken the water, we've taken the land, and it's time to give back what and acknowledge what's been taken. Thank you.
So it was a very informative session. We addressed a lot of questions, and Dr. Shirley talked about the resource war that's happening and the effects of colonialism. And I was also wondering about neocolonialism and the business of peace that we make, that so many professionals make today. But it's impressive how the both of you are working towards this cause and are inspiring many along the way. And a lot of youth are coming up and taking up these issues. Nowadays, youth is not being silent. Like, the power of social media is also so impressive. Any issue, anything, you can go viral, you can share your views, you can gather an audience which was not possible before. So it's important for the youth to be empowered. It is important for them to know not to stand back and to demand their rights, or to demand respect is not something you should stand back, because in so many developing countries, especially, the women are told not to stand up, they're told not to speak up, they're told to be homemakers. So that's not what we want anymore. And it's important for us to speak to them. It's important for them to have a way to talk to us as well. And such webinars help, because this was a live session. We had around 10 viewers right now, but this is going to stay on the Facebook page. It is going to stay there. Anyone can view it later, and anyone can have access to it. If anyone asks me about women who work the work that you do, I will tell them, go to the Facebook page and view this webinar, and they have spoken about their work. So thank you for taking time out and for presenting. And we have come to the end of our webinar. If you have any final thoughts, do share, or I will hand over to Dr. Kausar now. So thank you. Thank you so much.
I just want to express my gratitude and thanks for chairing and your extreme graciousness in working with my schedule. I really so appreciate it, and your wonderful questions and words.
Equally grateful for your wonderful insights, Monisha, as well, and the acute questions that you're able to pose, and Dr. Thompson for your wisdom. And thank you so much for the invitation, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, thank you for being with us for last 57 minutes in our clock. You have heard two very enlightened persons today about their works. Both of them are experts in their fields. Especially speaking about myself, I'm deeply impressed and inspired by the work of Professor Shirley Thompson right here in Winnipeg. And the audience, please follow her work. She's an inspirational leader, academic, and she's leading right from the front. And today it is absolutely necessary to bring a more women voice in environmental protection, as we have heard from both the presenters today. So once again, before we close this session formally, ladies and gentlemen and the audience, this event was sponsored by Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee as a part of Peace 365 Days event, and we deeply appreciate for their support. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, we look forward to bring Professor Shirley again and Natalija Vojno again to our session with their beautiful and impressive work and empowering women globally and locally. Thank you once again. Goodbye. Stay well.